From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hello and welcome to the UK Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Peter Kelly. I am Head of Psychological Health and Safety in the UK for Flourish DX.
And today I'm here with Hayley.
Hi Pete, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad. So, been on holidays, huh?
I have been fortunate to go on holiday in January. Who goes on holiday in January, right? Was highly stressed leading up to it and came back with...
Did you go skiing?
No, I did something quite adventurous, quite out of the ordinary. I mean, it doesn't sound out of the ordinary, but I walked a portion of the Camino de Santiago from Porto to Ponte de Lima. It doesn't sound hard, but it was really hard.
Was it cold or warm? I mean, I know it is winter, but they sound like they're warm places.
No, it was probably a little bit warmer than it was in the UK, but still relatively chilly. But I did miss the terribly cold spell that you all had last week or week before.
Yeah. Any blisters?
I won't let you have the gory detail, but yeah, the two baby toes struggled, and I ended up wearing some very fashionable strops for most of the walk because the hiking boots just didn't end up doing the trick.
Well, I was just going to, complain that I'd spent a week with Jason Vanchi in a small apartment in London, eating lots of steak, but I probably haven't got a really good position to argue from. And it was cold. Jason only bought one jacket, and it wasn't a very thick jacket. So we had a good time. We had a face-to-face meeting, which was really good. I really enjoyed that. So that's great. And now we have a special guest, don't we?
We do. Looking forward to diving in.
We'll let our special guest introduce themselves then.
Hi, Peter. Hi, Hayley. It's great to be here. So the special guest today is me, which is Kate Field, Global Head of Health, Safety and Wellbeing at BSI, the British Standards Institute. And for those of you who don't know me, I've been working in the world of health, safety and wellbeing for more than 2 decades now. And at BSI, I'm responsible for really developing our global strategy for creating a safer, healthier, fairer and more inclusive workplace. So it's a great job and I love it. And it's lovely to be here talking to you both again.
Thank you. Yeah, I did happen to meet you the other day, did I not, at another conference on wellbeing, where we heard another lot of information about individual approaches to tackling well-being, but I'm sure we'll cover that later. I would love, wouldn't it be lovely to go to these places and to be someone to be talking about organisational factors and well-being. So
we're rallying the cause.
Yeah, well, we're trying to do our best, So let me ask you this, Kate, what do you see as the role of standards for psychological health and safety, and particularly in the context of risk and risk assessments that we're obviously very keen on, as we're both ex-regulators.
Yeah. So I think I'll probably do it in 2 parts. I'll do kind of a general piece in terms of the role of standards. And I think, I know I'm going to sound like, because I work for BSI, which is a standards making organisation, that I'm preaching converted, but I've always been a fan of standards because standards answer the questions that organizations have. They want to try and do the right things. They want to get it right. They're looking for a framework of best practice. And that's what standards are. It gets industry and topic experts together in a room to come to a consensus about what best practice is on any particular topic. And they tend to focus on business risk. That was the the driving heart of standards. They go into many different areas, but they really focus on kind of business risk, because that's what organizations want help with. They have all of these different business risks, and they want to know how to tackle them the right way. So that's kind of how I think about standards. I think in terms of psychological health and safety, I think it's a really good example of it being brought to life. There's been this missing piece of the jigsaw when we look at occupational health and safety. The kind of, the physical risks are, I think, globally pretty well understood, still not necessarily well managed, but at least pretty well understood. Sort of how I might call it, physical health risks are starting to be understood more. So occupational cancers, occupational dermatitis, those sorts of things. But we have this huge gap that is missing around psychological health and safety. So the risks, the hazards and risks that give rise to work-related mental ill health, whether that's stress, anxiety, or depression. And we have a standard that's come along in ISO 45003 that has been written to address that gap, and give organizations a toolkit to manage psychological health and safety, to be able to do the risk assessment, approach it in the same way that you would occupational health and safety, but in the structured way to make sure that you cover everything.
Awesome. And then and that sort of leads me on to my next question. We've already used standards on physical stuff for the purposes of assessing the risk and putting, measures in place. And do you think 45,003 will help that journey, so that actually when people are looking at psychological health and safety risk in the workplace, this will help them to do their risk assessment?
Yeah, hugely. I think, one of the challenges with psychological health and safety is there's a lot of misconceptions and fear and, I suppose, stigma that starts to come through, because we're talking about aspects of mental ill health. And therefore, organisations have been reluctant to tackle it. They feel it's an area that they shouldn't go close to. So they kind of put it to the bottom of the list in terms of risk factors to look at. And as I think awareness has started to grow that it is an area that organisations need to look at, there's then this misconception that you need to be a psychologist, that you need some special approach to assessing the risk of from psychological health and safety point of view, and therefore they haven't done it. But I think what 45,003 does is make it very clear that you basically approach it in exactly the same way that you would any other health and safety hazard and risk. And what's great, the thing I think, there's so much I love about 45,003, but one of the things I love is the 3 tables of hazards that it lists. So, you don't, it's not as if you have to go, because when you're a health and safety professional, you're trying to work, learn about a new risk or hazard, you've got to do research, and then you've got to try and work out what it means to your organization. 45,003 gives you a list, and I've looked obviously at that list so many times, and I can't think that there's really any hazards that isn't covered. So you can go through that list one by one and go, right, how does this hazard show up in my organisation? Who's exposed, exactly as you would with a normal risk assessment. Okay, where's this hazard in my organisation? Who's exposed to it? How often are they exposed to it? And what might be the consequences? What are we doing already to manage it? And what more do we need to do? Exactly the same approach that you would take with any other health and safety risk. So, yes, that was a long answer to your question, Peter.
No,
Will 45,003 help with risk assessment? Yes, it will.
Good. That is the right answer after having spent 3 years on it. So, and you might like that list, but that list was not an easy task.
I can imagine.
It did take a number of days of very intense conversations and negotiations. But yeah, I think it does reflect on a new sort of phase, which really brings my next question. So do you feel there's been a change in how people view psychological health and safety since the pandemic?
Oh, well, yes, I suppose is the easy answer. I mean, I suppose this is where I taper it, because I think, I like to be a glass half full person. So the fact that we're talking about it more is fantastic. That there is more awareness is fantastic. The little tiny little part of me that's a glass half empty person gets frustrated that we were talking about this. When did the HSE launch their stress management standards, Peter? Back in 2004, wasn't it?
Yes. We started the work in 1999.
Yeah.
Longevity is a good thing, Kate.
Yeah. And there was talk there. I remember, when the stress management standards came out. I remember when. I'm getting old enough to do that now. Isn't that sad?
I remember producing the first standard that had 30 pages on demand, and we presented it to the business community and the unions, and they said, "You're barking mad if you think we're going to do 30 pages on demand."
Yeah. So I think, let's go back to the glass half full me. The pandemic was so difficult for so many people. People lost their lives, people lost their livelihoods. It's going to have a huge lasting impact across generations for mental health. But on the positive side, what we saw was, I've reflected it in terms of the corporate world rediscovered its humanity, because it was kind of this unique situation where literally everyone, so the chairman of the board, the CEO, down to the cleaner, were all faced with exactly the same challenges. The world went crazy, suddenly everything stopped, then we tried to restart it. And it really sort of broke down those hierarchical barriers. We were all human, we were all facing the same challenge. And I think that helped then the discussion in terms of the impacts that has on mental health generally. But I think as after kind of the initial lockdown, as people started to come back to work, there was so much concern and fear around getting COVID, either as an individual worker or contracting it and then maybe taking it back to your vulnerable relatives. The focus on the need to address these concerns within the workplace, these mental health concerns, really kind of brought it up onto the board agenda in a way that it just never had been before. And I think it's, we're 3 years on now from the start of the pandemic, and that has stayed forefront, and that sort of momentum to really look and understand the work-related causes of mental health is here, which I think is great.
What do you think, Hayley?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting hearing Kate's view from a standards point of view, because that you must see more clients potentially asking more questions. I think from other groups that I am part of in terms of leadership teams, external well-being people that I speak with, is there some challenge around whether this is going to drop off the kind of level of concern for leadership? Something else comes along. There are already some changes. We all had something to talk about and something to be able to relate to when we were going through it, that it quickly becomes work as usual. Life back to pre-pandemic. I know a lot of things have changed for a lot of people, but there are also a lot of things that I think a lot of people hoped would change and might not have changed. So I just think it's really interesting, that there's two sides of the coin. There are some great organizations that are, committed to making this sustainable and systemic change. But I do think, in my view, there is still a lot of work to be done in the UK specifically to get it right.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are still, although you could argue that we started the journey back in 2004, we are still at the start of the journey. I think a lot of organisations have got a long way to go. I don't think the pennies dropped across the board at all. So I think you're absolutely right, Hayley. But there is movement in the right direction, and that's the glass half full side of me. And I think as long as we can keep the debate alive and start to reflect really maybe what organisations are thinking about now, and people issues are still front and centre of their mind. There's huge issues with talent scarcity. I don't know whether you saw it, the UN Global Compact CEO report. They do one every year, and it kind of looks at what's the things keeping CEOs awake at night. And in terms of their kind of top issues, number 2 is around talent, recruitment and retaining talent. And if you've got a toxic workplace, you're not going to retain talent, and you're certainly not going to recruit talent. And a toxic workplace stems from poor psychological health and safety. Culture is a core part of psychological health and safety. So I think as long as we continue to be able to educate organisations and HR professionals and wellbeing professionals and the wider community that these people issues at their heart is psychological health and safety, then we'll continue to build momentum.
The education piece that you've said is so critical, and how it's foundational. It's not in addition to. I love the way you've made that link.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a very brief question, which is not bad for me. Some people don't understand why 45,003. Why 45,003 when we had this beautiful thing, ISO 45,001. I know why, but I'd like to know from your position, Kate, and then I'll hand over to Hayley, because I could just talk about this. So, why? So I guess why then? Why 45,003? Why do it?
You really could answer that question. You were involved in writing it. So I think the key thing, 45,001 was is based on is a core management system approach to occupational health and safety. Plan, Do, Check, Act. It came out of 18,001. And with international standards, it's got to reflect kind of the an international approach to occupational health and safety. And although, as Hayley and I just reflected, even in the UK, we're not very forward in terms of psychological health and safety compared to many countries in the world. We are streaks ahead. So, when 45,001 was written, it had to meet the needs of a global occupational health and safety community. It does, if you look at 6.1 and kind of look at the hazards piece, up there are some psychological health and safety risks. It talks about working hours, it talks about culture, it talks about leadership. But it didn't go into detail. And as we were just discussing then, there is a huge gap in terms of education around psychological health and safety. So there was a recognition by the committee that there needed to be a specific standard that really could take the health and safety community, line managers, HR, anybody through looking at psychological health and safety in a step-by-step way, and therefore, it was written to fill that gap. Did I get that answer right, Peter? What have I forgotten?
No, you got everything right. I just think it's incredibly good timing from ISO to launch a standard on psychological health just towards the end of a pandemic. Who'd have thought? For clarifications, we did start this process before the pandemic. It just, what a time to land. But I mean, I know Hayley's got a load of questions for you because Hayley's one of the people that's done it.
I know. Yeah.
I was just going to say, just so happens that during the pandemic, you had many long nights to discuss psychological health and safety, and that's why it finished at the end of the pandemic, because you had lots of time to get through it, right?
Your brain works really well at 1 o'clock in the morning when it's midday in Australia and it's somewhere yet. So it was a very interesting. We used to have to sacrifice each country area sacrificed the time to do that one, that 11 till 1 or 2 in the morning.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Before I jump in, I just want to reflect on Kate's comments around education. I remember the early conversations I had, myself and Jonathan, with you, Kate, around psychological safety and being told it's psychological health and safety. It's just those fundamental differences. And in the last episode, we spoke a bit about it. We've got an upcoming guest to speak about the differences, and it's that education piece for me. So, yeah. So what are some of the practical things you can do to ensure your compliance with ISO 45003?
So I'm going to have to be very geeky and just comment on the use of terminology. Sorry. So you don't comply with a standard. Compliance is for legislation. Standards are voluntary. They're not legislation. They're not required by law. So we conform to a standard. I have to do that. Otherwise, if any BSI people are listening, they'll tell me off for not mentioning it. So I think what are the practical things that you can do? So going back to the list, the tables. I love that list. Honestly, I was so happy when I read that. I was like, oh look at approach it exactly the same way as you would any other health and safety risk. Understand the hazards, and you've got a list of them, and start to go through and identify which are the ones that you think might apply for your organisation. And you might have to go and look at data. So you might have to look at absence data. You might need to have a look at incident data. You might include staff surveys. You might need to look at job descriptions. You might need to look at exit interviews. As you would with any other health and safety risk, you've got to go and look at the data. What's going on in your organisation. Are there particular groups that seem to be more impacted? Who's at greatest risk? And start to approach it that way. And I think one of the things that I'd say is that although we've talked about the fact that a lot of organisations maybe still don't understand psychological health and safety, I bet actually under your occupational health and safety, you're probably already doing bits and pieces. So you've probably, if you've got people who work with the public, you've probably got something that's addressing maybe bullying or violence or harassment by members of the public. That's a psychological health and safety risk. you might have considered that if you've got a high noise environment, that has an impact on people's psychological health and safety, in which case you've already started to address that. So, there'll be aspects that you're already doing. Then you'll need to work, and I think this is a really important piece to mention, is that although it's about occupational health and safety, you will need to work really closely and in partnership with particularly the HR community within your organisation, or people, or however it's framed, because other bits might sit with them. So there might be a policy around diversity inclusion. Flexible working policy, for instance, often sits with your HR. And both of those will be picked up within psychological health and safety. So it's kind of that evidence gathering piece to really start with. And then once you've got that, then you can start to see where the gaps are. You can start to see, and again, this is a health and safety approach, hierarchy, same principle, hierarchy of controls. What can you do to eliminate it, remove it completely? Then what do you do to manage it, or what's the educational piece? So, if you take that approach, then you're going to be, well on your way to looking at that conformance with 45,003.
Great. I just love how you said, sorry, Pete. I just love how you've spoken about data, the maturity of wellbeing strategies today. We need to mature into that data-driven decision-making. And I think it completely speaks into that space if you're looking to take the next step. But also about, you're probably doing so much already, but you're not joining the dots, and you're not broadening the understanding of wellbeing impact within your organization. So 2 key learnings and I think takeaways are, look at what you're doing, look at what you're already doing, and also look at what your data says. Sorry, Pete, what are your views on that?
Well, I'm just going to comment on the word compliance. Now, Kate, you are well on message. But one of the debates in the development of the standard is we have legislation that requires people to do risk assessment. So when we're talking about compliance, it's how does this help them comply with the legislation that's out there? Because ultimately, legislation is one side of the hammer of encouraging people to do what they should be doing, as well as doing all the other stuff. So, but you were totally on message.
Yeah. Oh, I have to be, because the standards. But you're absolutely right, Peter. And I think that's one of the things that's been interesting, isn't it? That particularly the management health and safety regulation here in the UK, where it talks about risk assessment. That's always covered, always had in scope psychological health and safety. So, and you're right. Standards are. One element of standards is to help organisations come up with the processes that they need to have in place to comply with the law. So there is an overlap, absolutely.
Yes, very helpful for the directive from the European Union as well, I assume.
Yes.
You regulators.
Oh, I know.
Oh,
we get very geeky.
I do love it. So,
you didn't. Oh, did you actually? I was to say, you weren't allowed to keep it.
Well, that's a worry,
but I think. Okay. I think I've got mine somewhere. I was like, you're not allowed to keep your warrant; they take it back.
No, you hand it over.
Yeah, you do.
On the last day, and. Thank you.
But I tell you what I do have, though. This is really sad, and we're talking about complying with the law. When I started, I don't know how the camera won't pick this up, but I have the card that has a caution on it for reading the caution to make sure you get it right.
We still have the card, and you still get the caution.
Yeah,
right, so.
You do not have to say anything. Anyway, sorry, we won't reminisce. We'll stop now.
Before you pull anything out of your box of tricks, both of you, I don't know what's coming next. Kate, I'd love to know about the uptake of the standard. What's your experience so far in terms of appetite, in terms of questions being asked from clients? We'd love to know more.
Yeah, so I think it's been phenomenal actually, which has been great. I mean, I think in the it was published just a year and a half ago, there-ish. In the run up to the publication, when we were doing, a lot more webinars that we were promoting or talking about it, we had some of the biggest audiences that we've ever had. It was at least as big as 45,001, which is kind of really saying something. And that interest is still absolutely there. I think, standards take kind of 5 years to kind of filter out into the global community properly, and really start to take off. So we're still in very much the infancy. But having said that, we've now got clients around the world who are using 45,003. It's gone global. And I think what's been really, we've had obviously a huge amount, I will say obviously, we've had significant interest in the UK, because, as I mentioned, although, we've got a long way to go, we're still kind of quite mature really, on this subject compared to the rest of the world. A lot of interest in places like Australia because of changes to legislation. And I think that will continue. And there's pieces of legislation already in Europe, but Peter's hinted that there's going to be more of a change. But I think what's been really interesting is the global uptake. And we had our first client in China at the end of last year. And there's certain countries and you think, what's their level of maturity on certain subjects and, what's that level of engagement? And you think, oh, well, that country that will maybe take longer for it to embed. We've now got clients globally. So it is growing in traction, and I think it will continue to do so. And I think, that legislation, because, work-related mental ill health is fundamentally the leading cause of illness and absence within organisations globally, even if we can't necessarily fully measure that. And countries' governments know that, and they know they've got to tackle it. So I think we'll just see an increasing level of focus and legislation, which will further drive uptake for 45,003.
Yeah, a 25% increase in depression and anxiety isn't just a blip.
Yeah.
It's a global issue and a global thing. So, the numbers are incredible, but I'm sure people are a bit counter that and say, oh, they're not, but they are.
So exciting to hear it's global. I mean, it makes me excited. It's the thing, that really gets me going. So yeah, just really excited to hear that, and just
Hayley, one of the first.
Yeah, at MCO. Yeah, when you were at MCO, you were the first in the world. Yay, you! Come on.
Thank you, Jonathan, and MCO UK as well. But yeah, no, it was.
You guys led the way.
Yeah.
I mean, it was So...
But there's no point in being first if you don't bring other people on the journey with you, and I think that's so important for me, and that's why we do this. Why we advocate and why we talk about it, and why we encourage other people to make those changes. Because, I'll get off my soapbox, but it's all about the sustainability and the goodness for everyone. Right. I mean, I could share some of my own, but I would love to know from your experience, Kate, the lessons organizations can gain from obtaining 45,003 status. Conformance?
Conform. Thank you. I think, there are different things. The common things you tend to see, and significantly with 45,003, is you see a culture shift. So you see an improvement in culture because organizations are focusing on their people, and really, those issues that are impacting that and those people. And I think this is one of the things that I suppose I've always found, I don't know, slightly odd or frustrating about health and safety, whether it's physical or whether it's mental, as we're talking about for psychological health and safety, is that it's about people. And if you look after your people, how are your people going to feel? They're probably going to feel, better, more loyal, more productive, more engaged, more committed to your organisation. And we see that coming through for organisations that have used 45,003, because you get a level of engagement from people because they recognise that the organisation is actually looking after them. But I think maybe some of the things that are that you see that people might not be so aware of, which I think is really interesting, is if you look at kind of sort of autonomy or the ability to have control over the way you work or flexible working. So if you look at aspects of work that give people autonomy or empower them, it has a really interesting impact on those individuals. It gives them a kind of a space and a freedom to be really creative. So one of the things that we see with organisations that use 45,003 is actually their level of innovation increases because they're unlocking all of this human potential, all this human creativity, because they're creating a culture where people are trusted, that they have they're allowed to engage and use their creativity, that new ideas are sought after, and that's really powerful. And I think a lot of organizations don't know that. More coming back to more practical things, we've talked about it helps you comply with legislation. Got to talk about that. It is an important part, and also not just necessarily health and safety legislation. I've mentioned that it links very closely through to HR and employment. So employment legislation, Equality Act, those sorts of things actually start to be improved in the way the organisation performs. Then you get the obvious things in terms of reduction of absent rates, practical things that are easier to measure. But I actually think the more interesting and exciting stuff is the stuff in terms of creating this environment to really unlock people's full potential and the benefit that brings for organisations.
Absolutely. I think you've kind of mentioned it in some of what you've said, but for me as well, the collaborative approach to really take away well-being from one person's role and actually to understand that everything your business is doing, when you look at that table, touches on well-being. Because if you're not doing it, or you're doing it in a way that is harmful to your employees, it's going to impact their well-being. So for me, it's that broader understanding that everything that you're doing, and there's so many key stakeholders, I think is such an important part of that. And then also the employee value proposition. And you've spoken a bit about it in terms of talent and scarcity, and it's a employees market, and how are we, we speak about the generational differences and what they expect and what they're asking in interviews in terms of, are you actually doing this? And I think when you get into the standard, and I've said this before, you realize that it's not as scary as it seems to be. You are doing a lot of these things already. Are there areas for improvement? But actually, people ask questions. As you start to get into it, people do ask more questions. They want to know about it. And then it has that roll-on effect of a better environment, a better culture, a sense of belonging, purpose, more inclusion, more diversity. So yeah, just a couple of things from me. Thanks.
Yeah.
Pete.
Sorry for the silence. I just had to cough. So, I mean, it was wonderful to watch the practicalities of something that you work on and to see it actually in action. And it is quite a, it's quite a proud moment when you think actually we did it. we've got 74 countries to agree that we could do something about this, and it was the missing link for me. It was that missing link between identifying the risk through the management standards process, but what else? What's the management system look like? And obviously, I view it from a regulator, an ex-regulator's hat, don't I? But the advantages, as you can see from there, are massive across the well-being of your workforce and improving on people's health and their psychological outcome as well. So, it was ready just when we came out of the pandemic. If ever there's a standard that really was going to be the right standard on the right moment, it was then. So I'm glad to see that it's being used in multiple countries, which is really important. So I'm going to ask you our last question, and this is: what would be the one takeaway you can leave our listeners with in relation to psychological health and safety? One takeaway.
I've been pondering this question, and
I'll let you have two because you're.
I think there's actually.
You can never put anything in one sentence.
No, I mean I can't answer it quickly. Obviously, that would be too much to ask. I was thinking what I want to do is to give people confidence that they can tackle this. That it's not scary. That you don't need to be a psychological health and safety expert. And I've been reflecting on this a lot. And I think actually that psychological health and safety is the easiest aspect of occupational health and safety to tackle, because it's about being human. So if we just stop back and reflect what impacts us as human beings, what impacts other people as human beings, and we will have all experienced this, then actually it becomes really easy to start to understand this, particularly when you have a framework for 45,003. So that's my one takeaway, is that actually this is the easiest aspect of occupational health and safety to tackle, because it's about being human.
And I think that's a wonderful way to end, because what we've all been trying to do is to put the heart back into health and safety, haven't we? That heart symbol, and Louise Hoskins during her time as president at IOS talked about that, and I think that's a really important thing. Actually take your heart into work and bring it home in the same condition. That's, for me, the thing that we should be focusing on, So thank you, Kate. Always nice to talk to you and to have some little inside jokes about inspectors. but so that's been fascinating. And Hayley's just sat there and gone, okay. And you two are finished.
I know. Hayley's very tolerant when we get together and we start getting sidetracked and reminiscing. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you to both of you. Absolute delight, as always, to spend some time talking about this hugely important subject.
Thank you very much. And we'll look forward to another time in the future when we'll be talking about this again, because I'm sure we will. All right, then. Bye for now, Kate.
Thanks, Kate. Bye.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.